quicker than and get on to the bulk of the Samuel story, which is really about David. Obviously, David's takes place here too, but this is kind of his time of trial, time of exile. He's on the run. He's a fugitive for most of these chapters, really till the end of the book. And then once Saul's knocked out, then we'll see his reign begin right at the beginning of 2 Samuel. So we'll try to move through these a little bit quicker, especially today. I don't want to spend too much time in 23 or 24, but try to get the bulk of our time in 25 today. Let's see, recap a little bit. What big event just occurred at the end of 22? Oh yeah, my mic. So what event occurred at the end of 22? Killing of the priest. Yeah, that was a doozy by Saul. As bad as the not killing the Amalekites was, turning around and being willing to decimate and destroy the whole entire priesthood basically is kind of a lot worse, isn't it? There we go. Just the fact that he was unwilling to kill off the wicked, the ones that were worthy of decimation, the Amalekites, and then these innocent priests that were not just his own countrymen, not just priests of God, but were innocent in what they were accusing him of. There was no trial, no sort of evidence put forward. David specifically made sure that they had. He didn't tell them what he was there for, that he was on the run. So he made sure that they could truthfully say they didn't know what the situation was. They weren't. They were just helping David because they thought he was a friend of Saul, and yet that didn't matter to Saul and his anger and his lust to destroy David. So now like I said, these next several chapters are going to be David just kind of on the run. In verse 23 or chapter 23, let's get to our slides here. There we go. So in chapter 23, a lot of what's going to happen over these next chapters is really, again, we're just contrasting. We're going to see David do things that Saul was supposed to do. We're going to see David acting righteously and then Saul not acting righteously, or David acting like a king when Saul would not act like a king. And here's the first example. Well, David hears about the Philistines going up against Keilah, which was kind of a border town close to the Philistine border. So those obviously were the towns that were under the most threat by the Philistines because they were closest. So this happened a lot. The Philistines are fighting against Keilah, raiding the threshing floors. Well, who is supposed to go and rescue the people of Israel that are under threat? Probably the king, right? He's in control of the army. He's leading the people. He should be the one to go and rescue them. But here's David, and he inquires of the Lord. Again, we haven't seen that happen too much with Saul. When he does inquire of the Lord, he probably doesn't get an answer. So David inquires of the Lord, should I launch an attack against the Philistines? The Lord says, launch an attack against the Philistines and rescue Keilah. But David's men, again, we're somewhere in between 400 and 600. At some point we switched to 600 men in the text. I can't remember where that's at, but we're 400 to 600 people that are following David, and they're going to go attack the Philistines. Well, that's kind of a daunting feat. They really, even though that's a good force, that's probably not enough to win against the Philistines. So they're a little bit afraid. Look, we're afraid here in Judah, it says in verse 3, how much more if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? They already got the Israelites in the area kind of upset against them. We got Saul mad at them and trying to hunt them down, and now you want to go and make the Philistines mad. Well, that wouldn't make sense, except, David wants to protect the people. So he inquires of the Lord again, which, okay, he inquired once. He wants to double check and say, I don't think this was a lack of faith on David. He's just, covering his bases, making sure that this is what the Lord wants. And you can kind of see the differences in the answer. Before the Lord just says, launch an attack and rescue Keilah. Now he says, go at once, and I will hand the Philistines over to you. So a much more complete and sure answer from David, or from the Lord, which is enough for David. He and his men go. To the army's credit, they do follow David, even though they had their reservations, but they're going to follow him. And they inflict heavy losses on them. David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. And at the end of the chapter before, 22, we saw that Abiathar, the lone survivor of the priests, fled to David, and this is where he met him with the ephod there. And then Saul hears about this. And it's interesting, when the Philistines are attacking Keilah, he doesn't do anything. But when he realizes that David's there, now he decides to muster all of his people, and he's going to go, and he says, oh, he's trapped in there. We can besiege him. We're going to go to war at Keilah, besiege David and his men. Now Saul acts like a king. He's going to go and muster the people and get them. So David hears about this. He grabs Abiathar and he consults the Lord through the ephod. David said, Lord God of Israel, your servant has reliable information that Saul intends to come to Keilah and destroy the town because of me. That's interesting. Saul's not just coming to capture David. We've already seen he's willing to destroy whole towns that are supportive of David. So seems like that would not, he wouldn't do that just once and not be willing to do that again. So there's not just the threat against David, but against his men and really anyone who harbors him, which is why he asked, will these citizens of Keilah, will they hand me over to Saul? And the Lord says they will, down at verse 12. So David and his men, numbering about 600, left Keilah at once, moved from place to place. When it was reported that David had escaped Keilah, he called off the expedition. And so David stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the country of wilderness of Ziph. Saul searched for him every day, but God did not hand David over to him. It's interesting, at verse 7, what does Saul say? Oh, God has handed him over to me. We're going to see Saul is still mentions God a lot, but it's always in a wrong way. God will protect me, or God will hand him over to me. Well, the text always goes against that statement here. But God did not hand David over to him. So it doesn't matter what Saul says. Usually what he says, God does the complete opposite. Verse 18, David was in the wilderness of Ziph and Horesh when he saw that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan came to David in Horesh and encouraged him in his faith in God. I love this statement. Jonathan, well, one, you got Saul can't find him, and then Jonathan can. He's going to be able to find David, and because he got two different reasons for wanting to find David. One's wanting to kill him, and one is wanting to not just encourage him, but encourage him in his faith. Why would David, of all people, need encouragement in his faith? He's being chased all over. He feels pretty low. I mean, he's been given these promises about him becoming king and all these things, but it's still not happening. I mean, this is we assume it's about 10 years that he's going to be a fugitive on the run, or living from the time of David and Goliath till the time he starts becoming king. So that's about a 10-year period. We don't know exactly where that is in here, but it's probably been a few years at this point. He's been running. He's been being chased by Saul. There's got to be some low points at this. So it's nice to have someone, especially, I mean, who better to encourage him than Jonathan, to come and say, encourage, not just that he's doing the right thing, but that God will continue to protect him, provide for him, and all those things that God said will come to pass. And notice how he says it. He says, don't be afraid. my father Saul will never lay a hand on you. So first thing, he's worried about his own safety. I mean, Saul's obviously trying to kill him. So that's one thing he's worried about. And here's Jonathan saying, no, he will never be able to lay a hand on you. Just as that statement before, Saul was trying to lay hands on him, but God did not hand David over to him. And here's Jonathan reminding him of that. He will never lay a hand on you. And then you yourself will be king over Israel. And it's probably one of the saddest statements here. You will be, I'll be your second in command. Jonathan envisions. Of course, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He knows part of what's going to happen. He knows that David will be king, but what he envisions is kind of a president, vice president. He's going to be a loyal supporter, a second in command for David. He's going to be his head of his army, whatever it is. He's going to support David, and who better to bring peace and unity than having Saul's son, the previous regime, Jonathan, as his second in command. So that's what Jonathan envisions, but obviously we know that's not exactly what will happen. And even my father Saul knows it is true. So he tells David that all these things, don't worry about them; they will happen. Even Saul knows they're going to happen. That's why he's trying so hard to prevent that. But he just reminds him that it's God. Put your faith in God, because that's who is in control of everything. So what he says will happen will happen. And then the two of them made a covenant in the Lord's presence. Afterward, David remained in Horesh while Jonathan went home. They've made these covenants before. I don't think that's a new covenant. Just every time he needs encouragement, David needs reminders. So Jonathan is providing those, that he will be supportive of him. And I think this ends up being the very last time that David and Jonathan see each other, at least that we see in the scriptures. Again, knowing the fate of Jonathan, he's going to be killed later on in battle. And this whole statement partially comes true, but the second in command part never comes to fruition. So kind of a sad last meeting here when you know the rest of the picture. But for David, this was needed to help encourage him. Any thoughts about chapter 23 so far? Oh yeah. And we'll see today, not just this, but later on when we talk about Abigail and Nabal, he needs not just encouragement, but kind of reminders sometimes. David, although at least in 1 Samuel, he's pictured very well, he's going to have some times where he has doubts, where he has to fight against some of his more evil nature, and we know that David is definitely not going to be perfect. So he needs these friends. We already saw his family come and to him, and he kind of cared for them. So he's not one that can take care of everything already. And he's still a young man. I mean, likely in maybe his mid-20s at this point. I think he's about 30 when he becomes king. So we're in the mid-20s, still a very young man. This is a learning time for him. He's learning faith, learning trust, learning hardship, just like all of us kind of learn at some points in our life. And then we have these Ziphites. Let me see if I have a map here. So we're really the area that we're going to be focused on in these next several chapters is this whole Judea area. So basically from like the north part of the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, all the way to the south. This is all Judah territory. From about Jerusalem and Bethlehem on down, all of that is the territory of Judah. And a lot of that, as you get farther south, is a lot more wilderness. What we think of when we see a picture of Israel. This part is a lot more like that. Not as much of the trees and nice farmland that we saw at the picture of David and Goliath, the Valley of Elah, but a little more wild, a little more rugged, which makes sense. There's caves, there's valleys, there's ravines, a lot easier to hide out from someone looking for you. So Ziph, you can see right next to the number 11, right smack dab in the middle of everything there, and then you can see Keilah, number 10 is where close to the Philistine border, not too far. And again, all these areas are, look at the maybe 5-10 miles from each other, so not a huge area, but definitely enough to be able to hide out. But David can get from one place to the other within a day or two pretty easily. So the Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah, and they basically end up betraying David. They tell him where he is, and so Saul, I'm kind of skipping a few verses here, but down at verse 26, he actually gets really close to capturing David here. There's like a big hill, and Saul splits his forces, and David's on the other side. So David's got like nowhere to go. He's trapped, and Saul's got two halves of his army coming at him around this hill. And at that moment, Saul, verse 27, gets a message that the Philistines have raided the land. So he has to basically break off from capturing David or from pursuing David to go take care of business elsewhere. So it's one of those kind of providential things that, David was about to be captured, and he just happens to get a message, and Saul has to leave and not capture him. So David names that place the Rock of Separation, and then he moves on to another stronghold. So kind of a quick overview of that section. But the Ziphites, remember them, they're going to cause David trouble a couple different times. And we'll see, again, all this area is Judah territory. And David is of the tribe of Judah. So if there was ever going to be a safe place for David, it would be in this territory. But we've got the Ziphites. Later on, when we talk about Nabal, he's a Judahite. All these people are, they're going to betray David. Keilah was a town of Judah, and they're going to not support him and betray him. Probably more out of fear, I think, than anything. David is still just a rogue leader of 600 men, whereas Saul is the king, and he's shown himself willing to take out whole cities in pursuit of David. So, given the choice, you obviously see why they would do what Saul says and want to show their support of Saul. That takes us to chapter 24. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told that David is in the wilderness near En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 of Israel's fit young men. So again, 3,000 versus 600, that's typically going to be no contest there. The 3,000 should win that one. So David's not looking to get into a pitched battle here. He definitely wants to keep on the run. Verse 3, when Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went in to relieve himself. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave, so they said, "Look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemy over to you so you can do to him whatever you desire." Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. One of the rules when you are using the restroom would be to go outside of the camp. That was part of the law of Moses. So they were not in the camp. He would leave the camp, go outside the camp, and he found a private cave to do his business. So he's far away from his camp, from his officers, his soldiers. Maybe there's a few outside the cave with him, but Saul is in a very vulnerable position, and even more so now because there's David and his men are hiding in the back of this cave, unbeknownst to Saul and his men. And you see David's men they say, "Hey, this is the moment. How perfect is this? This is clearly the Lord's doing. He's handed Saul over to us. We have to take him out now." But David got up and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Why what would be the issue there? I mean, he didn't kill him, so what? Why would David's conscience be bothering him at this point? The cutting off of the robe is very very symbolic. We've already seen robes being torn symbolically, even in 1 Samuel. Think back to 1 Samuel 15. Uh, Saul reached out and grabbed Samuel's robe and it tore, and it was a symbol of the kingdom being torn from Saul and given. And Samuel said, "And will be given to your neighbor." Well, I mean, this is, I think, supposed to be a reminder of that instance, and who is the one that has torn the kingdom from Saul here? It's David. He symbolically cuts the corner. I mean, he actually does, but I think there's a lot of symbolism there, and even this sign of I don't want to say it's disrespect, but even this bothers David's conscience that he even that he tore the robe from him. Again, it's more symbolism than anything. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And we got to remember, yes, there's that history as well, but he's also a son-in-law to the king. I mean, he lived there. He played music for him. I mean, it said earlier when David first started serving in Saul's court that he loved David. So there is a close relationship. I think it's similar. We've seen Jonathan kind of um, think more highly of Saul than Saul deserved, and not really quite believe yet that Saul would be as crazy and willing to kill as he is and do these wicked things. I think David might have that same tendency. He wants to think the best of Saul, and he definitely. I mean, I don't think he doesn't believe what God said that he would be the king, but he doesn't. I don't think he maybe envisions that Saul's going to be killed off anytime soon. He just, Saul will live out the rest of his days as king, and then David will assume the throne at that point, years down the road. And maybe that's his mindset. I don't know, but definitely this time and a couple of chapters later, when he has the opportunity to kill Saul, there's definitely not any. I don't know that there's much thought in his mind to kill him. He definitely rebukes his men pretty quickly when they say, "Hey, let's take him out right now. This is our chance." He doesn't have any. He doesn't mince words. He says, "As the Lord is my witness," verse 6. "I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." With these words, David persuaded his men and did not let them rise against Saul. So very, very strong. The Lord is my. I mean, he's swearing by the Lord right here. No higher name you can swear by that I will never do such a thing. Very strong language showing that David had no desire to harm Saul in any way, and even when he cut off his robe, that kind of affected him. And then just the language when he's speaking to Saul here. David got up, went out of the cave, and called to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave." Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift my hand against my Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed. Look, my father, he's calling him his father. Look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Recognize that I've committed no crime or rebellion. I haven't sinned against you, even though you are hunting me down to take my life. He's giving Saul a little bit of an out here. Who does he blame for Saul wanting to uh, pursue David? Who does he allow for Saul to blame here? Other people. He says, don't listen to the words of people. Someone advised me to kill you. Well, we know that this is all Saul's doing. This is all in Saul's mind. He's not being, manipulated by his advisors to go attack David on false pretenses or something. This is all in Saul, but David is at least giving him. Uh, I think that might be part of it. David thinks that someone's advising him, spoiling David against him in some way. He doesn't realize the extent to which it's all really Saul's mind that's doing this.
And certainly there are people in Saul's court like Doeg
Mm-hmm.
who, you know, they're not going to miss an opportunity to play to the political advantage.
Oh yeah.
But and that may have been behind some of David's writings in the Psalms where he's talking about people that he served with betraying him.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you do see David's humility here. He's trying to give Saul the best chance.
Yeah. Let's see there at verse 12. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but my hand will never be against you. As the old proverb says, wickedness comes from wicked people. My hand will never be against you. Who has the king of Israel come after? What are you chasing after? A dead dog, a single flea? May the Lord be judge and decide between you and me. May he take notice and plead my case and deliver me from you. So he's falling to the court of the Lord here. Let him decide. I'm not the judge. I'm not the jury. I'm not the one that will decide who is right and who is wrong. He reminds him of this proverb: wickedness comes from wicked people. Kind of similar to when Jesus talks about a fruit that or a tree that bears good fruit. Well, that's a good tree, If it bears bad fruit or it doesn't bear fruit at all, then you cut it down. Well, if he was really wicked, then he would do wicked things. And here was his opportunity. If he was truly wicked, he would have killed Saul. But he did not do that. So, ergo, that means that he is not a wicked man like Saul thinks. He is a good, a righteous man, not willing to. And he even humbles himself here. I mean, who are you chasing after? I'm just a dead dog, a single flea. I am nothing. Why are you so worried about me in this case? Let the Lord judge between you and me. And then we see kind of not a change of heart, but at least a change of language here. And we've seen this with Saul before. Obviously, he's been willing to say that I've sinned or I've done wrong, but does that come with a change of heart? It never does. So even these words that seem great don't change the story. He still continues to do the same things he's always been, but. Is that your voice, David, my son? No longer, where is Jesse's son? Now it's David, my son. Saul wept aloud and said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have done what is good to me, though I have done what is evil to you. You yourself have told me today what good you did for me when the Lord handed me over to you. You didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him go unharmed? May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done for me today. And now, remember when Jonathan had said, Saul knows all these things, that you will be king and all these things that will happen. Now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. Similar covenant that Jonathan made, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Don't wipe out my family. Protect me, protect my family. Saul is asking the same thing here. Don't kill off all my kids, which is traditionally what would happen when you have a change of regime. And David swears to Saul that he will do this. So Saul went back home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. It's interesting. Saul didn't even need to ask this. I truly believe David would have done this anyway. But interesting statements by Saul here. He knows what's going to happen, and yet we'll see this. He's going to continue to chase after David, and there's going to be another incident similar to this where he has a chance to kill Saul and he doesn't, and plenty of. I mean, there's no change, even though these statements are made. There's no change in Saul's behavior after this. Chapter 25, we have a kind of a little bit of aside here to remind us about Samuel. Samuel dies. All Israel assembled to mourn him. They buried him in his home in Ramah. David went down to the wilderness of Paran, and that's it. We get the one verse about this great man, but he's kind of fallen from the spotlight here, at least in the book for a long time. Not the last we'll see of Samuel, but and we just recently saw him helping David, and when Saul came and started prophesying just a couple chapters earlier. But just kind of an interesting. Oh, by the way, Samuel died here, and just kind of a humble. Not a big. He doesn't have this big tomb anywhere. He's just buried at his home in Ramah. Kind of a contrast to Saul, who set up memorials and monuments to himself after victories a couple chapters ago. Well, Samuel just quietly kind of goes away here. And then we get back to David here. A man in Maon had a business in Carmel. He was a very rich man with 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name Abigail. The woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, was harsh and evil in his dealings. So we're introduced to these two characters. The thing to remember is the wealth of Nabal, the beauty and intelligence of Abigail. One reason I think why it's mentioned that he's a Calebite. Caleb was a pretty good guy. Remember, him and Joshua were two of the men that of the 12 spies that actually said, "Hey, let's go up and attack the Canaanites. We can win." And it was because of the people believed the other 10 spies that they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years. So Caleb was a good guy, but his name actually means dog. So not the best name, but he was able to overcome that kind of bad name. Nabal here is not able to overcome his name, Nabal, or his clan's name, dog. He was a man harsh and evil in his dealings. Just kind of a wicked, evil, not a very good man. So David, he's close to where Nabal and his huge flocks, 3,000 sheep are, and he's been kind of guarding those sheep. We're kind of in a vulnerable area, close to the Philistines. His flocks and his wealth would have been prime targets for raids by the Philistines or some of the other nations around them. So David and his men have been protecting them up until this time. Well, now it's the time of shearing the sheep. So David is going to ask for some payment. I mean, I've been protecting you. I've been taking care of you. You've not lost any of your sheep or any of your men or flocks or anything during this time. All we ask is to be paid what we're due. He's not exacting any exorbitant sum or anything. He even says, he says, "Long life to you, peace to you and your family, peace that is all yours. Please give whatever you have," at the bottom, "whatever you have on hand to your servants, to your son David." He lets Nabal set the price. Whatever you think we've earned by protecting you, you pay it, and we'll be happy with that. He doesn't say, "Oh, you need to give us half," because you wouldn't have any if we hadn't been there. He just says, "Pay us what you think we're due." And then Nabal shows his true colors here. He says in verse 10, Nabal asked them, "Who is David? Who is Jesse's son? Many slaves these days are running away from their masters. Am I supposed to take my bread, my water, my meat that I butchered for my shears and give them to these men? I don't know where they are from." Does Nabal not know David? Has he never heard of him before? He's heard of him. Yeah. So this is it's tough for us to see, but this is pretty harsh language. You're just saying, you are nothing. Who are you? What have you to do here? I don't know where you're from. Who is David? Who is Jesse's son? I mean, he's definitely heard of him, but he's like, you're nothing. Get out of here. I'm not going to pay you what you're owed, which is amazing because he's got more than enough to pay David and even his 600 men. I mean, a couple sheep would be able to feed them. Remember, this is a kind of a wilderness area, so it's tough to find food in an area like this. So David needs food. This is not just he's trying to build up his coffers. He's just trying to feed his men so they don't starve. Verse 12, David's young men retraced their steps. When they returned, they reported all these words. And he said to his men, all of you put on your swords, basically saying, to arms, we're going to go take this guy out. He's insulted us. He's said these slanderous words against us, so we're going to go take him out. And he had 400 men with him to attack Nabal. He left 200 with the supplies. So, I mean, yes, Nabal had some big flocks, but he doesn't have 400 men to defend himself. And this would have been a massacre. He just shows his foolish nature to anger someone that has such a large force when he doesn't have a defending force like that. So just very foolish by Nabal's part. And one of the young men informed Abigail, Nabal's wife, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed at them. The men treated us very well. David's men treated us very well. When we were in the field, we weren't harassed. Nothing of ours was missing the whole time we were living among them. They were a wall around us. A hedge of protection would be a good Bible word. Both day and night, the entire time we were with them, herding the sheep. Now consider carefully what you should do, because there is certain to be trouble for our master and his entire family. He is such a worthless fool talking about Nabal. Nobody can talk to him. Why is this young man telling Abigail about this? Fear for his life too. I mean, he knows, he can see the writing on the wall. David's not just going to come and kill Nabal. He's going to come and take out the whole clan, the whole group in his anger, no matter what. So it's going to be trouble for his master and his entire family. And can he go to Nabal with this concern? He's a worthless fool. We're going to see that fool word again a lot. Nobody can even talk to him. He doesn't even try to talk to Nabal. This is the extent of Nabal's character and what people know about him. They can't even go and reason with him and talk to him because he's so foolish in what he does. So Abigail, on the flip side, Abigail hurries. She's not going to sit back and see how things kind of play out. She hurries, and look at the size of this gift that she gathers up. This shows the wealth of Nabal. If she can all of a sudden just produce 200 loaves of bread, 2 clay jars of wine, 5 butchered sheep, a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. That is a big old kitchen right there. And she hurried. This isn't just, she spent a week preparing this. I mean, they must have had this much just lying around and more, I would assume. So more than enough, again, more than enough to offer David and his men some food, some payment, some thanks for all this. Just shows, again, the foolishness of Nabal. It wouldn't have been any trouble for him to do that. And Abigail, has all that ready to go. She says, go ahead of me. I'll be right behind you. And she does not tell her husband Nabal because, nobody can talk to him, right? He's such a worthless fool. If she told him what she was doing, he would probably say, don't do that, and prevent her from going. So she's wise enough to know, like, let's do this. Let's keep him out of this. So she rides to David, and David had just got done. They actually end up meeting on the way. He's on his way because Nabal paid him evil for good. And may God punish me and do so severely if I let any of his males survive until morning. That servant was not wrong in in his worry. He knows he's probably going to die because of Nabal's foolishness, and I'm sure Abigail kind of understood that too. So Abigail, just an amazing character here. She runs into David. She bows down, pays homage, and she puts she is a she puts herself in the path of the hurricane right here. She says, "The guilt is mine, my lord, but please yet let your servant speak to you directly. Listen to the words of your servant. My lord should pay no attention to this worthless fool Nabal, for he lives up to his name." His name really does mean fool. That word Nabal means fool or stupid, and stupidity is all he knows. I, your servant, didn't see my lord's young man whom you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who kept you from participating in bloodshed and avenging yourself by your own hand. May your enemies and those who intend to harm my lord be like Nabal. Let this gift your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. So who is really kind of guiding events here? Who made sure that David runs into Abigail before taking out this entire family? The Lord. And why? David's about to make a pretty big mistake. And that's why we have this right up against that story of David showing mercy to Saul. He didn't want to lay his hand on the Lord's anointed, even though Saul was definitely guilty of a lot of things. David knew that he needs to allow the Lord to enact vengeance. It wasn't David's job to do that. And yet here's David. Obviously, he got pretty mad, and he's wanting to exact vengeance on Nabal for this insult that Nabal had, and really for stealing him. I mean, David expected some payment for what he was done. He worked for it. He rightly so expected to be paid for what he was doing, and Nabal is stealing from him, which again, in this area, it's not like he's got a Walmart next door that he can go and get food. This is a life and death situation here, and Nabal is letting him starve basically. And so of course he's going to be mad, and he would have, if Abigail hadn't come, if the Lord hadn't sent Abigail, he would have killed Nabal and all his family. And what would have happened then? What would be the big picture results of David enacting vengeance in such a way? Lost respect, lost credibility. Saul would have had plenty of ammo against him then. Like, look, David is a menace. He goes off and kills whole families for insulting him. All of those things that Saul and whoever supporters of Saul were saying about David would then be true. And David would have lost all the respect. He would not have been above reproach, is another good Bible word that we use. He would not have been above reproach if this had happened. And in God's mercy on David, he sends Abigail to intercept him and remind him of that. And she reminds him that David's enemies will be flung away. What do you think of when we talk about stones from a sling? Goliath, yeah. She knows David's history a lot better than Nabal and anyone else does. She knows David's history, so she uses that, I think, with reason. David's enemies will be taken care of by the Lord. David doesn't have to do that himself. When the Lord does for my Lord all the good he promised you and appoints you ruler over Israel, there will not be remorse or troubled conscience for my Lord because of needless bloodshed or my Lord's revenge. So she knows what's going to happen to David. She reminds him of that. David believes that, and she's protecting him from having this kind of cloud of his past over him. Now, when he becomes king, he doesn't have anything to regret about, or certain things that his enemies can then use politically against him. So Abigail, just a blessing from God, and David, to his credit, he listens to her. Again, this is a man listening to a woman. That doesn't happen very often. Definitely not in the Bible era. Women were not, even intelligent, beautiful women like Abigail were not respected in the same way. But he hears her, he blesses her. May your discernment be blessed, and may you be blessed today. You kept me from participating in bloodshed and avenging myself by my own hand. And it turns out that the Lord, not 10 days later, or actually that night, or that next day, takes care of the thing for him. So here's Nabal. While all this is happening, like a fool, he's off getting drunk and having a big feast. And then the next day, his wife tells him about it once he's sobered up, and his heart died, and he became like a stone. And 10 days later, Nabal was struck dead. So Nabal, God took care of the situation for David. He didn't have to take out Nabal. He just had to be patient, and that's exactly what happened. Nabal's evil deeds were turned back on his own head, and then we see that Abigail left such an impression on David that he after Nabal's death, he asked her to marry him, and she becomes one of his wives there. All right, so we'll stop right there, and we'll pick up there in chapter 26 and probably 26, 27, 28 on Wednesday. So try to have that read before Wednesday's class. Thank you.